There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to change your life. You make a plan. You design the perfect routine. You promise yourself that this time will be different. And then, quietly and painfully, everything falls apart again. It is not dramatic. It does not explode. It simply dissolves. One skipped morning, one tired evening, one moment of, "I will do it later." And suddenly, your new habit becomes your old disappointment. Andrew Huberman often warns that the problem is not your discipline. It is not your motivation. It is not your identity. The real issue is that most habit routines are built in ways the brain cannot sustain. We overwhelm ourselves with intensity, deadlines, stacked behaviors, and rigid schedules. We expect the brain to adapt instantly, without understanding its architecture, its limits, or its fears. The truth is that the nervous system has a psychological threshold. Too much friction, and it shuts down. Too much pressure, and it rejects the routine before it begins. Too much expectation, and it triggers avoidance instead of engagement. You may think you failed the habit, but in reality, the habit failed your brain. There is a gentle, almost invisible science behind long-term change. One Huberman describes with rare clarity. A science built not on willpower, but on pacing. Not on intensity, but on safety. Not on perfection, but on understanding the emotional cost of effort. So before you try another habit routine, before you set another alarm or write another list, let us step into the psychology that has been guiding your behavior all along. Most habit routines begin with excitement, a kind of bright optimism that makes everything feel possible. You imagine the person you will become, the discipline you will embody, the transformation that will echo through your life. The fantasy is intoxicating, but beneath that excitement lies something quieter, something far more fragile. The assumption that the brain will simply go along with your plans. Andrew Huberman warns that this assumption is the root of burnout. Habits collapse not because you lack motivation, but because you overwhelm the nervous system before it understands what you are trying to do. When you take on a dramatic new routine, you trigger a sudden spike in cognitive demand. The brain interprets this surge as a potential threat. Too many changes at once. Too much energy required, too many unknowns. This is what Huberman refers to as limbic friction. The emotional strain that occurs when your intention and your internal state collide. The friction does not appear because the habit is wrong. It appears because the threshold is too high for your nervous system to cross comfortably. In this burnout trap, effort becomes misinterpreted. The brain begins associating the habit with stress. Even before you begin, you feel a heaviness in your chest, a reluctance in your body, a mental tightening that whispers, "Not today." This whisper is not laziness. It is the brain protecting its resources. It senses that the habit demands more than you can sustainably give. It predicts failure before failure occurs, not to discourage you, but to shield you from emotional cost. The more intense the routine, the faster the burnout arrives. You may push through for a few days, maybe even a week, driven by excitement or guilt or hope. But as the novelty fades, the cognitive load remains. The nervous system grows tired. The internal resistance grows louder. The habit becomes something you dread rather than something you desire. And once dread enters the picture, collapse is inevitable. Yet there is an even deeper layer to the burnout trap: shame. When the habit breaks, you blame yourself. You assume you lacked discipline or consistency. But shame narrows cognitive flexibility. It shrinks your capacity to try again. It pushes you into cycles of all or nothing behavior. Intensity followed by exhaustion, intention followed by avoidance. Huberman notes that this emotional volatility is one of the greatest barriers to lasting change. The burnout trap is not about weakness. It is about misalignment. When the routine does not match your brain's pacing, it fails. When the pace respects your biology, It lasts, and understanding this difference becomes the key to escaping the cycle of starting over again and again. This is where we move into the emotional territory, the part of the story most people ignore, the hidden cost of trying and failing repeatedly, and how it shapes your relationship with habits more than the routines themselves. There is a quiet kind of grief that grows each time you try to change your life and end up right back where you started. It is not dramatic. It does not erupt. It settles softly, silently into the background of your identity. You begin to carry a subtle doubt, a private suspicion that maybe you are someone who begins things but cannot sustain them. Each failed routine becomes a small crack in your confidence, a reminder of the promises you made to yourself and quietly broke. You do not talk about this grief, but you feel it. In the morning when you wake up tired, at night when you remember what you planned but did not do. It becomes a quiet weight. Andrew Huberman often describes how the nervous system forms emotional associations long before it forms habits. When a habit collapses, the collapse becomes an emotional memory. The brain pairs the task with disappointment, guilt, or effort that ended in failure. So the next time you try to start again, you are not starting fresh. You are starting with emotional residue, lingering friction that shapes your willingness to try. This is why the second attempt feels heavier than the first, and the fifth feels heavier than all of them. The mind remembers. But there is another layer to this, the identity echo. When you try a routine and fail, you do not simply lose the routine. You lose a piece of the identity you were trying to build. You feel the distance between who you are and who you hope to be. That distance can become painful, and the brain avoids pain. So even before you begin a new routine, avoidance begins forming in the background. Not because the habit is hard, but because the emotional memory attached to it is heavy. The emotional cost deepens when the collapse feels personal. You start telling yourself stories that were never true. I cannot stay consistent. I do not have discipline. I always fall off. These are not objective observations. They are emotional conclusions shaped by fatigue. Huberman explains that the brain under stress becomes rigid, and rigid brains create rigid stories. These stories become barriers that sit between intention and action. They become internal walls you must climb every time you want to try again. And yet, beneath all this heaviness, something else remains, something soft. The desire to change does not disappear. The longing for a different rhythm stays alive. Even after the disappointment, even after the shame, even after the doubt, there is a part of you that still believes in the possibility of becoming someone steadier, someone kinder, someone aligned with their own life. This lingering desire is not a flaw. It is a sign that the brain is trying to understand what went wrong. It is searching for a way to change without being hurt again. And that search brings us to the heart of Huberman's warning. That habits fail not because you are broken, but because the architecture is. To understand how to rebuild, we have to examine the neuroscience beneath the collapse, the wiring that sabotages your routines before they even begin. When Andrew Huberman talks about habits, he does not start with motivation. He does not start with discipline. He starts with architecture, the invisible structure beneath every behavior. Because a habit is not simply an action you repeat. It is a relationship between your brain, your environment, your emotional state, and the friction that lives between them. Most routines fail, Huberman warns, not because the behavior is wrong, but because the architecture collapses under its own weight long before the habit has time to form. At the core of this architecture is limbic friction. This is the emotional resistance you feel when your intention collides with your internal state. It is not laziness. It is not a lack of willpower. It is the limbic system detecting stress, uncertainty, or excessive effort and trying to pull you back toward comfort. Every time you impose a routine that is too intense, too rigid, or too sudden, You increase limbic friction. And when limbic friction outweighs your available energy, the brain chooses escape. But friction is only part of the warning. Huberman explains that habits fail when dopamine baselines are unstable. If your brain has been overstimulated through constant novelty, endless scrolling, late-night screens, your dopamine baseline drops. When the IQ baseline is low, even simple tasks feel heavy. Effort feels punishing, starting feels impossible. If you try to build a habit in this depleted state, it will feel like dragging yourself uphill. Not because the habit is inherently difficult, but because your chemistry is out of alignment. Then there is cognitive overload. Many people create routines filled with 10 different steps. Wake up early, meditate, journal, stretch, cold shower, gratitude list, run, read, plan. These routines look impressive on paper but are biologically unsustainable. The prefrontal cortex, the executive center of the brain, can only hold a few actions in working memory before it becomes overwhelmed. When you stack too many behaviors together, the brain stops understanding what the habit actually is. It feels like a blur of effort rather than a single actionable step, and the nervous system rejects it. Huberman's warning is simple but profound. The brain cannot adopt what it cannot process. When routines are too big, too sudden, or too emotionally loaded, the nervous system perceives the habit as a threat rather than a pathway. This triggers avoidance at the structural level, not because you failed the routine, but because the routine failed your brain's design. The final piece of the warning is behavioral reward. If the brain does not receive a sense of completion, satisfaction, or relief after the habit will not stick. The nervous system needs to feel rewarded, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, quiet way, to mark the behavior as safe and worth repeating. Without reward, habits dissolve. Understanding this architecture changes everything. It reveals that your failed routines were not evidence of weakness. They were evidence of a structure that was never built to hold you. And knowing this allows you to rebuild from a place of compassion instead of pressure. Now we can step into the part that brings relief: how to construct habits in ways the brain actually accepts. There is a gentler way to build habits, one that does not demand intensity, perfection, or rigid discipline. A way that works with your brain instead of against it. Andrew Huberman often emphasizes that sustainable habits come from lowering limbic friction, stabilizing dopamine, and designing behavior in a way the nervous system can actually hold. When you understand this, habit building stops feeling like a battle. It becomes a form of care. The first shift is reducing emotional load. The brain resists habits that feel heavy, dramatic, or tied to identity-level expectations. If you tell yourself, "I must become a new person," your limbic system hears threat. It anticipates failure before you even begin. But if you say, "I will do this for 2 minutes," the brain relaxes. 2 minutes does not trigger alarm. It does not activate fear of failure. It is a small invitation rather than a demand. And the nervous system is far more willing to accept invitations than ultimatums. The second shift is simplifying the architecture. Most people try to build habits by stacking multiple behaviors, believing complexity equals progress. But the prefrontal cortex can only handle limited cognitive load. When you ask it to juggle too many new behaviors, it becomes overwhelmed and shuts down. Huberman suggests breaking routines into micro-actions, single steps that are easy to understand, easy to execute, and easy to repeat. Put on your running shoes, open your notebook, step outside. The I. Simpler the action, the less resistance it creates. The third shift is leveraging state-dependent learning. Your brain learns habits more effectively when your internal state matches the behavior. If you try to meditate while overstimulated, your body rejects the practice. If you try to exercise in a low-energy crash, everything feels harder than it should. Understanding your state, calm, tired, alert, restless, helps you match the habit to the conditions where it can actually succeed. Huberman often notes that habits stick when they are paired with the right physiological window, not when they are forced through the wrong one. The fourth shift is designing friction in the right direction. You want to reduce friction for the habit and increase friction for the escape. If your phone is beside you, distraction is one reach away. If you move it across the room, the limbic cost of picking it up increases, and avoidance becomes less automatic. Similarly, if your journal is open on the table, instead of hidden in a drawer, the brain perceives less effort in beginning. These tiny environmental tweaks shape behavior more effectively than motivation ever could. The fifth shift, the most important, is creating micro-rewards. Not external rewards like treats or praise, but internal rewards like relief, clarity, or a moment of stillness. Huberman emphasizes that the brain needs to feel something good immediately after the behavior, even if that good is simply the absence of pressure. When the brain associates the habit with relief rather than strain, it begins to crave the habit instead of resisting it. These gentle shifts do not transform your life overnight. They transform the conditions that once made change feel impossible. And in that quiet transformation, something inside you begins to breathe again. Now we arrive at the softest part of the arc, the moment where change becomes sustainable, not because you pushed harder, but because you finally stopped fighting yourself. There comes a moment, often so quiet you barely notice it, when the idea of changing your life stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like a possibility again. It does not arrive with adrenaline. It does not appear in a flash of motivation. It shows up in the gentlest way, like the way morning light touches a room before you are fully awake. Soft, patient, unhurried. This is the beginning of sustainable change, the point where your nervous system stops bracing for another failed routine and begins trusting your intentions again. Andrew Huberman often describes the nervous system as a pattern recognition machine. It learns not from your goals, but from your states. When you push yourself too hard, too fast, the brain learns to associate change with threat. But when you move slowly, consistently, and kindly, it learns to associate change with safety. Safety is what makes habits last, not intensity, not ambition, not pressure. Safety is the soil where repetition finally takes root. As you begin this slower approach, something subtle happens. Effort becomes quieter. You no longer feel the need to transform your entire identity in a single week. You no longer fight your own resistance as if it were an enemy. You begin to understand that resistance is just information, signals from a nervous system that has been overwhelmed too many times. And when you stop treating those signals as flaws, they lose their sharpness. They soften into guidance. With this softness, habits become less about discipline and more about rhythm. You start small, almost invisibly small, and you repeat. You give your brain little victories to celebrate instead of big failures to fear. Huberman explains that these micro-wins increase dopamine in gentle waves, raising your baseline rather than spiking it. A stable baseline is what makes effort feel natural instead of exhausting. It is what makes the habit feel like something you grow into, not something you chase. Over time, you may notice that the pressure lifts. The narrative inside your head shifts. You no longer say, "I have to change everything." You say, "I can begin again." And that simple sentence carries a different energy. It carries patience, permission, compassion, the kind of compassion that creates long-term consistency without forcing it. And then, almost suddenly, you feel something you have not felt in a long time. Alignment. Not perfection, not mastery, just alignment. Your internal state and your external actions begin to match. You feel less fragmented, less ashamed, less at war with yourself. This is the serenity at the end of the arc, the place where change stops being a performance and becomes a relationship. a relationship with your biology, a relationship with your effort, a relationship with the part of you that still believes in becoming. And if something in this section felt like a breath you have been holding for too long, you may write, "I am ready to change gently," in the comments, as a small reminder to your nervous system that this time, the pace will be different. If you made it all the way here, I want to thank you, not for watching, but for feeling this with me. Videos like this are not about motivation. They are quiet spaces where we listen to our minds without judgment, where we understand instead of forcing, where we begin again without the weight we used to carry. If this message brought you clarity, or relief, or even the smallest shift inside your chest, I would be grateful. If you subscribe to the channel, it helps this community grow, but more importantly, it gives you a place to return to whenever you need steadiness. If you felt something today, you can type, "I receive," in the comments. Sometimes one small phrase is enough to anchor a new beginning. And if you want to continue exploring the psychology behind habits, motivation, and the gentler way to change, there is another video waiting for you. One more step, one more breath, one more moment of understanding. Thank you for being here.